Today, I'm going to get you all ready for the start of the 2022 college football season by telling you about some of the best teams in the country and also about some sleepers or dark horse teams that we should be keeping our eye on as well throughout the regular season. You know, last year we saw some big dogs in the sport take a step down and really come back down to earth a little bit as teams like Clemson, Ohio State, and Oklahoma all failed to reach their respective conference championship games. And oh, by the way, all three of those teams were favored to win their conference championship games coming into the year last year. So in a sport that isn't supposed to have much parity, you know, compared to a sport like the NFL where you get rewarded with the number one draft pick if you have the worst record. You can't consistently outbid other teams for the best players since there's a salary cap. You know, in college football, a sport that isn't supposed to have as much parity, we still see big-time upsets on an annual basis, heck, a weekly basis in the sport. So with that said, you know, any given Saturday. And we are going to start in the SEC today as Georgia and Alabama played in the championship game last year, and coming into this year, 3 of the top 6 national championship odds come from teams in this conference. So we'll head to Georgia first, and here's the good news for Bulldogs fans heading into the 2022 season. And many of you who closely follow recruiting will be able to attest to this too. I strongly believe that Georgia has the potential to be as good as anyone at retooling and reloading a roster that just lost a ton of talent to the NFL. I mean, when it comes to attaining and keeping blue chip players and prospects, you know, having depth at key positions on an annual basis, and ultimately being able to field a competitive team a year after losing 5 first-round draft picks, a bunch more to the draft, and maybe even some undrafted players. Although Georgia hasn't done it yet because it was their first national championship since the 80s, I think they're ready to step in and do that and prove that they can reload, essentially. Now, the other thing I really like and admire about Georgia football in the Kirby Smart era is that they not only have depth at Georgia, but they use it. I mean, halfway through the 2020 season, the year before they won the national championship, Georgia had by far and away played the most players, particularly on the defensive side of the ball, compared to any other team in the SEC. So I think that played a huge role in Georgia being able to win the national championship that next year because they got young players ready to participate and play in big roles the next season. Now, it is fair to be a little concerned about the offensive line coming into this year as they don't have guys like Justin Schaefer and Jamari Sawyer anymore. But even with that said, if you think about it, Georgia has been known for developing and producing good to great offensive linemen in recent memory. So I do think it's a unit that can be very good at some point during the season. And I haven't even mentioned the fact that as opposed to the previous 2 national champions in Alabama and LSU, Georgia gets their quarterback back in Stetson Bennett. Now, you know, they lose guys like George Pickens to the NFL, Burton as a transfer to Alabama, and speedy wideout Arian Smith to yet another injury. But even with that said, guys like Adonai Mitchell, Kearis Jackson, and tight end Brock Bowers, who might be the best in the country, I expect all of those guys to contribute in a big role this season. Now, I really believe iron sharpens iron, and even considering the fact that there are new bodies up front, that guys are going to have to play larger roles on the offensive side of the ball, really both sides of the ball, I think Georgia is poised to have a really big season and over-deliver, if you will. And a big plus is that, you know, like I said, they get Stetson Bennett back and their offensive coordinator, Todd Monken, back. So moving on to the next team, breaking news, Alabama is the odds-on favorite to be the national champion in 2022. Now, like I said at the beginning of this episode, I like to think that there's parity in college football, and there really is if you think about it. I mean, there have only been 3 repeat national champs since the 80s. But if you told me over the past 3, 4, maybe 5 years where there was a year in which Alabama was supposed to be the favorite, I think it would be this year. And, this team has a lot of things working in their favor. Let's start with the fact that they have the best one player on each side of the ball combination in the sport. It's really not arguable when you're talking about Bryce Young and Will Anderson. They also snagged 5 blue chip players out of the transfer portal since last offseason. And if anything, there are some unproven pieces, particularly on the offensive side of the ball when you consider the departures of Jamison Williams and Evan Neal and a few others, but it's not something that Alabama hasn't had to deal with before. I mean, coming into last year, they had to replace starters, and they still made it to the national championship game. And, similar to Georgia, like I said, this team has championship pedigree nearly every year because of the way they recruit, because of depth at key positions, and also because of great coaching staffs. Add in the fact that there are rumblings about this being one of Nick Saban's best defenses at Alabama. When you consider the front seven, when you consider the safeties coming back, I think the only position that is a little uncertain, but not lack of talent at all, is the cornerback position. But it is going to be a complete defense regardless for Alabama this year. So there's your 2 SEC teams. Let's move to the Big Ten. And, after winning the Big Ten for 4 straight years, Ohio State came up short in 2021, and seemingly everyone in the program was pretty upset about that, very disappointed in themselves. I think this is a program, a team that is just itching to get back out there on the field and compete at a high level again. I will say they're going to need to commit to being a more physical team this time around, as they allowed well over 200 yards in each of their losses last year to Oregon and Michigan. So I do expect defensive coordinator Jim Knowles to give that unit a boost and to bolster the defensive line a little bit. Although there are a few unproven players in that front seven, I do expect this defense to be better this time around, particularly up front. Now, the only cause for concern on the offensive side of the ball is figuring out who the secondary playmakers are going to be behind Jackson Smith-Njigba and TreVeyon Henderson, as C.J. Stroud looks to, win a Heisman this year if Ohio State has the type of year that they want to have. And, the well is not dry. There's always great blue chip prospects ready to step up in this program. We just don't know who those guys are going to be yet, but we will soon find out as they open with Notre Dame. Now, my question is there enough smoke in this conference to have Ohio State trip up somewhere along the way? Whether it be a Penn State or a team like that, or maybe a Wisconsin early in the season. We don't know, but either way, I expect Ohio State to be in contention to play for that conference championship game in the last week of the season when they play their rivals to the north. Now, how about Clemson? I decided to mention Clemson next since they have the next best odds outside of the top 3 schools to win the whole thing this year. Now, I do expect quarterback DJ Uiagalelei to take a step forward this year. We all know that he struggled last year. Quarterbacks coach Brandon Streeter, he doesn't have a ton of coaching experience. He is a younger guy, but he does know Clemson about as well as anyone. He's been there for a long time. So I expect the offense as a whole to get better. We know that it's going to be a fierce defensive front. It always is. Probably a pretty complete defense. But again, I just go back to the offensive side of the ball. And, expectations were sky high last year as they did win less than 11.5 games, as they were projected to win 11.5 games last year. But, a full year of starting for DJ Uiagalelei, although he struggled, I believe is really going to help. And, coming into the year last year, you could tell that he really struggled in a couple of areas. He struggled against pressure looks, and he also struggled with footwork in the pocket at times. And, reports out of camp were that he's doing well, he's playing at a high level, he's in great shape. So I'm expecting big things from him this year. And ultimately, if Clemson has the type of year that they want to have, I think either DJ or running back Will Shipley will be in Heisman contention at the end of the year. And with the way I've been talking about Clemson over the past minute, they are slated to win 10.5 games this year. I think you guys can tell, if I was a betting man, which way I would be leaning in this instance. So there is a significant drop-off in terms of national championship and playoff appearance odds after those first 4 teams, between Georgia, Bama, Clemson, and Ohio State. So I decided to mention a few, blue blood programs, and as I said at the beginning of the episode, some sleeper teams as well. So we're going to look at the Big 12 first, and let's start with Oklahoma. Brent Venables really waited for the perfect head coaching opportunity, and I believe he found it at Oklahoma. He gets to go back to where it all started, and he gets to change the identity at the place he once upon a time called home. We all know about the deadly quarterback-coordinator combination that is going to be Dillon Gabriel and Jeff Lebby this time around for Oklahoma. But what really has me excited about this team is that I think they're going to have a complete offense, outside of Dillon Gabriel. Whether it be Marvin Mims, who's a guy that averaged over 20 yards a catch last year. They also went into the portal and grabbed a few receivers when you consider the likes of a guy like LV Buckley Shelton or J.J. Hester. So they really have a good offensive line perennially. I'm not too worried about that. And, they also have receiver Drake Stoops. So similar to Ohio State, if those secondary playmakers step up and play a big factor for this team, I think they can be in contention in November. They're going to be a tough out either way. And, maybe Brent Venables doesn't have all of the bodies that he wants on the defensive side of the ball just yet, but that will come in due time. He's a fresh new coach, so with a couple of recruiting cycles, this defense is going to step up. And they are the odds-on favorite to win the conference for a reason. Maybe Brent Venables will raise the overall ceiling of this program so they can once again truly compete for a national championship. Now, I know in 2017 they had that game against Georgia, but Georgia really did whatever they wanted in the second half of that game in the Rose Bowl. I will say that was a good team, with Baker Mayfield and all of those guys. But, they haven't had, outside of that game, they haven't had great showings in the college football playoff against superior competition. So maybe Venables raises the ceiling for this program. We move on to the next team, and how about the Longhorns? Because what if I told you that there was a team that went 5-7 in the 2021 season, has to play Alabama in week 2, and is going to start lots of young players at various positions? At the same time, this season, that team is projected to win 9 games, has the second best odds to win their conference behind Oklahoma, and even got one first-place vote in the coaches' poll. That team would reside in Austin, and I am, in fact, bullish on the Longhorns this year. Now, reports out of early fall camp haven't been great, as they're dealing with some season-ending injuries, particularly on the offensive side of the ball. But when you're in that state, and that said state has the kind of high school football talent that it has, and you've actually recruited at a pretty high level, even considering the recent coaching turnover, I expect you to overcome those problems. The offensive line as a unit is going to give a little bit of cause for concern, as they are going to be young at some spots. But if guys other than Xavier Worthy step up as playmakers, they can take a huge leap offensively and really be one of the best offenses in the country. Now, the last position group I'll mention with this team is the quarterback room. As many of you know, Quinn Ewers was recently named the starter at Texas, and ultimately, to me, this was probably the right move for the Longhorns. Even though Quinn hasn't started a college game yet, I believe he provides the type of upside at that position that Texas needs, as opposed to a guy like Hudson Card. Whereas, you really know what Hudson Card is based on last year in, limited action, but you still got to see him play. Whereas I think a guy like Quinn Ewers really stretches the defense, gives you more accuracy, and ultimately just gives you more juice as a program. So I think it was the right move for Texas. And, this team is going to learn a lot about themselves in that Week 2 matchup against the Crimson Tide. Now, I've got two teams left, really three teams. One of them is in the top 10 for the coaches poll, and the other is unranked. So I don't know if you can consider a team that is in the top 10 for the coaches poll a dark horse team, but they still have long odds to win their conference championship, so I decided to mention them anyway, and that team would be Michigan. You know, Michigan's projected to win 9.5 games in 2022, and even with the departure of Josh Gaddis as offensive coordinator, who got the most out of that unit last year, I still believe this offense can take another step forward because of the skill and continuity that they will have as they get a lot of receivers back, obviously the quarterback back, and a good offensive line. You know, the last thing I'll say about Michigan is that even though they have to replace some key defensive starters, let's be honest, this is their conference now. They finally tasted what it was like to win the Big Ten and take down their arch rival. You don't think they're starving to prove that they can do it all over again? So, you know, I believe a trip to Indianapolis will be on the line in the Horseshoe during the last game of the regular season. So with that said, I think both Ohio State and Michigan will be in contention to play in Indy, you know, in the last week of the season. I think both are going to have great seasons. So I've got one team to go. At this point, I don't think you'll be able to guess who this team is, but I'll give you two hints. So they've always underwhelmed in terms of expectations, and at least in the last 10 to 15 years, and they reside in the SEC. Yes, you probably know which program I'm talking about now. Yes, it is the Tennessee Volunteers, and even with that schedule, I'm not guaranteeing that they're going to represent the SEC East in the conference championship game, but I am suggesting that they might be able to win 10 games, have a pretty good season. And many in the national media are still concerned about the defensive side of the ball, but I just look at the fact that they are top 20 in returning production, and they had a top 10 overall offense last year. And the last thing I'll say with Tennessee is, you know, is it possible that at the end of the year we're holding Josh Heupel in that same breath as guys like Lincoln Riley and Ryan Day? I think he's a great offensive mind, and I think Hendon Hooker's going to have a great season, so we'll see what happens. All right, that's going to do it for this episode. Stay tuned before this week ends. I am going to preview that Week 0 game between Nebraska and Northwestern, and then I'll probably have an SEC preview as well. And then next week we will be heading into Week 1 where I will be previewing lots of big-time matchups. That's the other thing. I know I missed on the Pac-12 today, but I am going to hit on Utah, Florida. I'm going to hit on Oregon and Georgia, and then ultimately USC as well when they get to their big game. So again, thanks for watching and stay tuned.